So Chodesh Tov, we've reached the month of Kislev, and the main event of the month of Kislev is clearly Chanukah. Everyone loves Chanukah. Who doesn't love lighting the menorah? Who doesn't love eating oily foods like sufganiyot and latkes? And of course, our kids love opening lots of presents. And so Chanukah is clearly a crowd pleaser. But what we don't think about as often is this. Chanukah is actually a very mysterious holiday, more mysterious than you might at first realize. And it's so mysterious, in fact, the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat asks a very surprising question. It asks, Mai Chanukah? What is Chanukah? It's a funny question for Chazal to be asking. So that's what we're going to dig into tonight. What is Chanukah? What's the holiday about? And so here's the game plan. First, we're going to go through the classical sources about the holiday, the Mishnah, the Gemara, some Midrashim. Okay, second, then we're going to go through some other ancient texts that talk about Chanukah, but are not part of our religious tradition. So these are things like the books of the Maccabees and Josephus and others. And we'll need all that as background as well. And then we'll try to process what all these texts are telling us. So what does all this mean for the way that we celebrate the holiday of Chanukah today? The goal isn't just to give a history lesson. The goal is really to take away certain nuggets that hopefully help us experience the holiday in a deeper way today in our lives. Okay, so that's the game plan. So let's start with some basic background and then we'll build up. So Chanukah is a rabbinic holiday, meaning its source of authority is D'Rabbanan. It's from the rabbis, not D'Oraita. It's not from the Torah. It's different than holidays that were, other holidays of the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Pesach, etc., that are all found in the Torah itself because they're way older. But Chanukah, and also Purim for that matter, celebrate events that happen much later in Jewish history. So their source can't be from the Torah itself, chronologically. So rather, they're of rabbinic origin. Okay. So as opposed to other holidays where we have a layer of laws that are D'Rabbanan that kind of sit on top of an underlying base of laws that are D'Oraita, the laws of Purim and Chanukah are D'Rabbanan all the way down, you could say. But it's worth noting that Purim and Chanukah are treated quite differently. So for example, the holiday of Purim is linked to its own book of Tanakh, Megillat Esther. That book lays out for us very clearly what the holiday is about. And there's a mitzvah to D'Rabbanan to, of course, to read the Megillah on Purim every year to remind us. So Chanukah, on the other hand, has no biblical book associated with it. There's no book of Tanakh to explain what Chanukah is all about. And another big difference is that there's an entire tractate of the Mishnah, Masechet Megillah, that deals with all the laws related to Purim, all the laws related to the writing of the Megillah, to the reading of the Megillah, to other mitzvot of the holiday. Okay, and just like Pesach has Masechet Pesachim, and just like Sukkot has Masechet Sukkah, so Purim has Masechet Megillah. The rabbis have a lot to say about Purim, but there's no Masechet of related to Chanukah. The bottom line is that the earliest Jewish sources have way less to say about Chanukah than they do about Purim. And just to drive this home a little bit further, let's think about that in a little more detail. So Chanukah is mentioned in the Mishnah 7 times in scattered places, typically, though, only in passing. So the Mishnah basically assumes that we know what Chanukah is, but it doesn't really tell us that much about the holiday itself. So just to give you a feel for this, we learn in a Mishnah in the second parak of Masechet Ta'anit that you can't decree a public fast on Chanukah. But that comes up as part of a longer list of days when we don't fast. Okay, so in this list, Chanukah is just one more holiday, like others, in which we don't fast. Or similarly, the Mishnah in Masechet Megillah tells us what sections of the Torah are read on Chanukah, but that's just part of a longer list of what sections of the Torah are read on all holidays. Or the Mishnah in Moed Katan tells us what kind of funeral rites are not allowed on Chanukah, or allowed or not allowed on Chanukah. Once again, this is just part of a broader conversation, and it just about mourning and eulogies, and it just happens to be that Chanukah is one example. So I'm not going to go through all of the 7 cases here, but you start to get a feel. In no case does the Mishnah focus or go into any real depth about the holiday of Chanukah itself. The only thing that we can learn from the Mishnah about the practice of the holiday of Chanukah has to do with the fact that the Mishnah implies that there's something about candle lighting involved. But even that's really alluded to indirectly. So where that comes up is in Masechet Bava Kama, which is the tractate of the Mishnah and the Gemara that deals with damages, right? One person damaging, harming another, basically torts. So there's a case discussed there where it talks about a camel that's walking through the shuk. And the camel is carrying bundles of flax on its back. And the bundles of flax on the camel's back catch fire from a fire that belongs to one of the shopkeepers, a lamp that belongs to one of the shopkeepers. So you can imagine this camel, it's got this flax hanging off its back and it lights on fire. And the question is, who bears the cost of damages? Who's liable when the flax on my camel's back catches fire from a lamp in your shop? And so the question is, should the owner of the camel be liable because it's his fault for not taking care and make sure that the flax on his camel's back doesn't catch fire? Or should it be the shopkeeper's liability because he should have taken care to make sure that the lamp in his shop, or that he's responsible for, that he lit, doesn't light other people's stuff on fire? Okay, so the Mishnah's answer is, it depends where the lamp was placed. If the lamp was inside the shop itself, then the owner of the camel is liable because he should have been more careful to make sure that the flax on his camel's back isn't flopping around and stretching into someone else's shop. But on the other hand, if the lamp was sitting outside the shop, if the shopkeeper put a lamp outside his shop, then it's the shopkeeper's fault because he has to take care of a fire that he's placing outside his shop in the way of normal passersby. Okay, so with all that as background, at the end of that Mishnah, Rabbi Yehuda adds 3 words. He says, Bener Chanukah Patur. If it's a Hanukkah candle, then in that case, the shop owner is exempt. And presumably, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is this: if the lamp in question is a menorah, right, or a candle for Hanukkah, then it's normal for Hanukkah candles to be placed outside on Hanukkah. Everybody knows that. So on Hanukkah specifically, everyone should be extra careful about candles. And in that case, even if the lamp, the menorah in this case, is located outside the shop, then in that case, the owner is still exempt, because basically when you're going with your camel through the shuk, specifically on Hanukkah, you should be extra careful. But those 3 words, Bener Chanukah Patur, are all the Mishnah has to say about Hanukkah candles. Not the number of candles, not who should light them, number of days, how long they should last. None of that's in the Mishnah. I point that out only so we should be aware. So the Mishnah doesn't have a ton to say about Hanukkah, but again, the Mishnah takes for granted that we know what Hanukkah is. It just doesn't go into any depth about the why or even the what, for whatever reason, okay? Now, the Mishnah is, let's say, 350 or so years older than, after the events of Hanukkah. By the time we get to the Gemara, that now you're talking about like 750-ish years after the events of Hanukkah. Now in the Gemara, we start to get some details. It doesn't have its own Masechet, but we start to get more details, the kind of details that we're used to thinking about the laws of the holiday. And there's one place in the Gemara, as I mentioned in Masechet Shabbat, where the Gemara also asks the question, not just the what, but also the why. And it asks, Mai Chanukah. This is the famous, Mai Chanukah, what is Hanukkah? Gemara. So why don't we go through that, and that will be kind of the first of the traditional sources that we'll go through. So let me share screen and we'll go through it together. Hopefully you can see this. So, okay, so this is, it's in Masechet Shabbat, and really the whole story of Hanukkah candles comes up originally tangentially. The Gemara then starts by saying, Amar Rav Huna, Ptilim u'shmanim she'amru chachamim ein madlikim bahem b'Shabbat. Rav Huna says, any wicks or oils which are not allowed for lighting Shabbos candles, ein madlikim bahem b'Chanukah. They are similarly not allowed to be used on Hanukkah. That's the entry point by which the Gemara in Shabbat starts thinking about Hanukkah and going into detail. So then it continues at that point, going through a series of laws that have to do with Hanukkah itself. So for example, Tana Rabbanan, Mitzvah Hanukkah, Ner Ishu Beito. This is famously the part of the Gemara that talks about, who's supposed to light, how many lights. So is it one per house or is it one per person? Different levels of mahadrin or mahadrin min mahadrin. Okay, so that's a bunch of laws about lighting candles. Then Tana Rabbanan, Ner Chanukah mitzvah lehanicha al petach beito mibachutz. You're supposed to light Hanukkah candles outside your house. Okay, more details about the laws of candle lighting. Then it goes on to say, Amar Rava, tzarich ner acheret lehishtamesh. This is basically the laws of the shamash, why we need to have a shamash. So, okay, so various laws. And then out of nowhere, the Gemara asks, Mai Chanukah. What is Hanukkah? Okay, so let's go through, and it's kind of surprising, So, okay, so now let's go through what the Gemara answers. Mai Chanukah. The Tana Rabbanan, B'kafhei b'Kislev, Yomei de Chanukah, Tamanya inun, delal mispad behon, udelal hitanot behon. So on Hanukkah, we have this 8-day holiday where we don't eulogize, we don't fast, and then it gives an explanation of why. It says Keshenichnasu Yevanim laheichal, when the Greeks entered the Beit Hamikdash, Tim'u et kol hashmanim beheichal, they made all of the oils impure. Uchshegavra malchut Beit Hashmonai v'nitzchum, and when the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees, triumphed over them, badku v'lo matzu ela pach echad shel shemen sheyamunach bechotmo shel kohen gadol. And they found, this is, of course, we know the pach hashemen, this one container, this one jug of oil, which still had the seal of the kohen gadol, showing that it had not been kind of tainted and it was still pure. Okay, v'lo haya bo elel halik yom echad, but there was only enough to light for one day. Nes, there was a miracle that happened. He liku mimenu shmonayamim, and it lit for 7 days. L'shana acheret kav'um v'asum yamim tovim behalel v'hoda'a. And then in future years, they established a holiday for Thanksgiving, basically. So it's important to understand that these lines that the Gemara is using to explain the background of Hanukkah originate actually in another book. So they actually come from a book called, it's maybe even not quite a book, but it's a kind of a small scroll, you could say, booklet called Megillat Ta'anit. Okay, and that Megillat Ta'anit, it's actually a little confusing. It's not a Megillah like Megillat Esther or Ruth or Shir HaShirim. Instead, it's it's kind of like a booklet that goes through the Jewish calendar, and it notes 35 days on which something special happened, something so special that we should not fast on that day. Okay, so it's a little confusing because it's called Megillat Ta'anit, the scroll of fast days, but it's actually a list of days on which you don't fast. And just to give you an example of what these are, so most of these special days in Megillat Ta'anit are from the Hasmonean period. Not all of them. Some are older, some come later. But just to give you a feel for the month of Kislev, here are the entries from Megillat Ta'anit. So on the 3rd of Kislev, certain Greeks, there's a holiday that certain Greek insignias that had been placed in the Beit HaMikdash were removed. And that was good news. And because of that, became a celebration. So to commemorate that, that good event, we don't fast on that day, or at least they didn't, I should say, in the times of the second Beit HaMikdash. Okay, next entry. On the 7th of Kislev is the date of the death of Herod the Great in Roman times. That also was considered a happy enough day that we should not fast on that day. Next entry. There's on the 21st of Kislev was something called Mount Gerizim Day, Har Gerizim Day. Okay, and that commemorates a story where the Samaritans tried to turn the Greeks against the Jews and they failed. And because almost this bad thing had happened and it turned out not to have happened, kind of like actually a little bit of Purim-esque, so then again, it's a happy celebration day. We don't fast on that day. So you're starting to get the feel by now that of these 35 days that Megillat Ta'anit tells us about, a lot of them are holidays that we don't celebrate anymore. Okay, but they were celebrated in the times of the second Beit HaMikdash. And then we get to the next entry in Kislev, the 25th of Kislev. And that, from there on, is what the Gemara is quoting. Okay, so now let's actually look. Hopefully this is still on screen. What I tried to do is just put them side by side. So this is Mai Chanukah, the Tana Rabbanan. This is the whole thing we just read. Okay, now this is Megillat Ta'anit. So just to put them side by side, so it says the Chavhei Day, in this 25th day of that month, Yom Chanukah, and Timanya Yomin Delo Mifsed. Here it only talks about not eulogizing. It actually doesn't say that we shouldn't fast, but because it's in Megillat Ta'anit, it's taken for granted. That's the whole context. So, okay, so that's kind of the intro. That matches this part from the Gemara. And then the next section, it's not exactly word for word, but it's pretty close. It tells the story, it's 90% the same words and telling the exact same story about the Pach Hashemen and all of that. Okay, that's what's in the Gemara. But then interestingly, and by the way, that's the way Megillat Ta'anit works, is that the oldest part of the text is this, right? And this is always in Aramaic, and it just lists the day and maybe gives it a name. And then there's a Hebrew kind of later commentary that explains what exactly was happening on that day. So the Hebrew commentary, which is all part of one text now as we have it, continues on. And let's just go through the rest of Megillat Ta'anit's explanation. It says, Umara'u la'asot Chanukah chet yamim. It asks a question. It says, and why is Chanukah 8 days long? V'halo Chanukah she'asa Moshe b'midbar lo asa ela shivat yamim. When Moshe inaugurated the Mishkan, that was a 7-day celebration. V'chen matzinu b'Chanukah she'asa Shlomo shelo asa ela shivat yamim. So too, the Chanukah, the inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash, the first Beit HaMikdash under Shlomo, was also a 7-day celebration. So the question is, why is this Chanukah 8 days long? So it says, Bimei, this is the answer, Bimei Malchut Yavan, Nichnasu Beit Chashmonai Laheichal, Uvanu et HaMizbeach, Vesadu Basid, V'tiknu bo kol klei sharet, V'hayu mitaskim bo chet yamim, Shmonai yamim. So it says that when, in the days of the Greeks, when the Hasmoneans entered the temple and they built the Mizbeach and they got it, whatever, they got it ready, and similarly, all the other utensils, it took them 8 days. Interesting. Above it already talked about the 8-day miracle of the lights. But for whatever reason, this section explains 8 days differently, not based on 8 miraculous days of candle lighting, but instead just that it took 8 days to prep, let's say, this time around. Okay, and then it goes on to say, Umara'u lahadlik et hanerot. And why did they light candles? It says, Ella bimei, why do we light candles? Ella bimei malchut yavan shenichnasu beit chashmonai leheichal shiv'a shipudin shel barzel biyadam. So when the Hasmoneans entered the Beit HaMikdash, they found 7 spears of iron. It's very interesting. This isn't something we typically learn, but this is it basically says that they took 7 spears, and of course the menorah has 7 candles, not Hanukkah has 8, but the menorah has 7 candles, and they took these 7 spears and they turned it into a menorah. Okay, it's actually a very powerful image of it. Kind of links up in some ways the winning of the war and the spiritual victory, right? They took the spears and they turned it into a menorah. Okay, very beautiful. So in the original Megillat Ta'anit, there are kind of 2 things that have to do with candle lighting. One is the miracle of the 8 days, and the other is this kind of special menorah made out of spears of iron. And it's interesting that this spears of iron idea also shows up in another, in a midrash, Sikta Rabati, which asks, it says, why do we light Nerot Chanukah? And the answer it gives is that they found their, just to cut to the chase, they found their 8 iron spears, fixed them in the ground, and lit lamps upon them. Okay, so the same idea shows up in this other midrash. So let me stop sharing for a minute. Okay. So, but I should point out, sorry, I'm Sikta Rabati, so just a note, it mentions the spears, it doesn't mention the oil, it doesn't mention the 8 days. And okay, so we've seen these kind of two different rationales for the candle lighting, and we also saw kind of a little bit of a different explanation for why 8 days. Okay, sorry, I actually need to let me stay on share. We have a number of sources to go through. Okay, so it's been, okay, so that's kind of another key source. Another key source, just so we're all kind of on the same page, is Al Hanisim, right? So it's been pointed out by many that Al Hanisim, which, you know, the prayer of Al Hanisim really focuses less on candle lighting and more on the war. So let's just read it through together again, just in the interest of our all being on the same page. So we all know Al Hanisim, Val Porkan, Val Gvorot, Val Shuat, Val Niflaot. Depending on your nusach. Okay, so anyways, this is the prayer where we say thank you to Hashem for all of the wondrous miracles and specifically of wars won. Okay, and then we say Bimei Matityahu, and it tells the whole story. And we know this is, you know, Ravta et Rivam, Danta et Dinam, Nakanta et Nigmatam. This is the whole prayer about how they were able to win their battle. That you, Hashem, helped them win their battle, and you gave the strong into the hands of the weak, and the many into the hands of the few, the impure into the hands of the pure. Okay, so we all know that. And then at the very end, it says, and after this, which was all of this section where we talked about the battle and the miracle of this amazing war that we won over the Greeks, then it says, afterwards, so they purified the temple, okay, and they lit these candles, and they established the holiday of Hanukkah. Okay, so this we're all familiar with. Okay, but again, no mention. There's a kind of a stress on the war. There's a mention of candle lighting. Nothing specific about the 8 day miracle of Tah Hashem. Okay, so now those are all the kind of classical sources that we're used to, you know, using. Now I want to go through some other sources that we're not used to thinking about, but it's good to go through some of the other ancient sources, just give some background material. And I think the way I think about it is, I think that it helps us understand a little bit better some of the points that Chazal were talking about, because we've seen that Chazal are touching on these different themes, and it's just helpful to have a little bit more background about some of the other old sources, frankly, that are older than the Mishnah. So let's go through a few of these, and there'll be some good data points that will help us understand some of Chazal's statements better. So the first one to go through is from the first book of 1 Maccabees. There are a bunch of different books called Maccabees, but this one, 1 Maccabees, just as background. So this is a book that dates from Hasmonean times. The original was in Hebrew. We don't have the original in Hebrew. All we have is a Greek translation, but it's written kind of like in the form of a chronicle in the way of the Hasmonean dynasty, similar to the way that Melachim, the book of Kings, or Divrei Hayamim, tell the story of the kings of Yehuda and Israel. So this is told in a similar style. It's not part of Tanakh, though some Christian churches consider it a holy book. But anyways, it's a book that tells the story of the Hasmoneans, how they got there, and what happened to them. And in terms of dating, it's thought that that it might be written somewhere around 100 BC, let's say, which would put it, the actual Hanukkah story is 164 BC. So it's not contemporary exactly, but it's not so much older than the actual Hanukkah story. Okay, so let's read through, just to give you a feel. We're not going to read the whole book, obviously, but just to give you a feel of what this book is about. And specifically, actually, the book is not about Hanukkah, I should say. It's just that Hanukkah is one of the things that happens in this book. So for example, it says, then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. So this is the background of Antiochus basically imposing paganism on the Jews, And some Jews went for that and Hellenized, and others didn't. And the ones who were really upset about it wind up being the Maccabees. Okay, so now continuing on. Now on the 15th day of Kislev, in the 145th year, the Greeks, erected a desolating sacrilege on the altar of burnt offering. So basically, they start going into the Beit HaMikdash and messing it up, doing all kinds of terrible things. And then on the 25th day of the month, 25th day of Kislev, they offered sacrifice on the altar that was on top of the altar of the burnt offering. Basically, on the 25th day of Kislev, the Greeks really defiled the Beit HaMikdash by offering impure sacrifices on the Mizbeach itself. Okay? And then, skipping to chapter 4, then Yehuda and his brothers said, "See, our enemies are crushed. Let us go up to cleanse the sanctuary and dedicate it." Then Yehuda detailed men to fight against those in the citadel until they cleansed the sanctuary. So we know about it, right? This is Yehuda Maccabean leading the revolt and ultimately getting into the Beit HaMikdash, and he starts cleaning it. And then they took unhewn stones, as the Torah directs, and built a new Mizbeach, like the former one. And they made new holy vessels, and they brought the menorah, and the altar of incense, and the shulchan, and they offered incense. Okay, I'm not going to go through all of it, but basically, he sets up the whole Beit HaMikdash as it was in a proper way. Okay, and then here's where we get to something super interesting. It says, and then early in the morning of the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month of Kislev, they rose and offered sacrifices the Torah directs on the new altar of burnt offering that they had built. So they celebrated the dedication of the Mizbeach for 8 days and joyfully offered burnt offerings. They offered a sacrifice of well-being and thanksgiving offering. Okay, so let's think about a little bit what we just read. Okay, so the book tells the story of the Greeks, the Seleucids, a section of what had been formerly Alexander's kind of Greek empire. Okay, under Antiochus, they imposed Hellenism and paganism by force. It tells of the rise of the Maccabees, their victory, their cleansing the Beit HaMikdash. In one Maccabees, there's no explanation of why 8 days. It mentions an 8-day holiday. It doesn't explain why. There's no special focus on the lighting of candles at all. The menorah is just one of the kalim that is in the Beit HaMikdash. It mentions the menorah, but there's no special stress on it. And the whole focus of one Maccabees is on the rededication of the temple. On the very same day of Kislev, when the pagans had defiled it a couple of years before. Okay. Now, moving on to there's another book called, let's call it 2 Maccabees, second book of Maccabees. This is a different book, also written during the Hasmonean period, also not contemporary with the events, but again, kind of older than any of the traditional sources that we have. And the first 2 chapters of that book, as we have it in the form that we have it today, are actually a letter being written by Jews in Eretz Yisrael to Jews in Egypt. And they're asking the Jews of Egypt to celebrate this holiday, the holiday of Hanukkah. Okay, so let's go again. Let me just read some excerpts because it'll give you a feel of what this book is. Not what the whole book is about, but the part of the book that is talking about Hanukkah, let's at least give a feel for it. Okay, so just the intro. The Jews in Jerusalem and in the land of Judah to their Jewish brethren in Egypt, peace and salvation. That's this part where it's written in the form of a letter, basically saying, let me tell you about this holiday of Hanukkah and why it's important and why you should celebrate. Okay, so since on the 25th day of Kislev, we shall celebrate the purification of the temple, which basically Hanukkah, right, is kind of like the rededication of the temple. We thought it was necessary to notify you in order that you may celebrate, this is interesting, the festival of Sukkot and the festival of fire, given when Nehemiah, who built the temple and the Mizbeach, offered sacrifices. Okay, we'll unpack that in just a minute. To just kind of file that away. That's unusual. The festival of Sukkot and the festival of the fire given somehow to Nehemiah. Okay. For when our ancestors were being led captive to Persia, the pious Kohanim of the time took the fire of the Mizbeach and secretly hid it. Okay. Tells this whole story about Nehemiah. He brings the fire back, the original fire of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. And then continuing on later in chapter 10, it happened this is part of kind of like the story of the Hashmonaim in this book. It says it happened on the same day on which the sanctuary had been profaned by the foreigners, the purification of the sanctuary took place. That is, on the 25th day of the same month, which is Kislev. Okay, we already saw that. So this is in line with what we saw from the first Maccabees, right? That the Chanukah itself, the cleaning and rededication of the temple, was done on purpose to match the day that the pagans had defiled it. Okay, now they celebrated this holiday for 8 days with or rather, I shouldn't say this holiday. They celebrated the rededication for 8 days with rejoicing in the manner of the festival of Sukkot, remembering how not long before, during the festival of Sukkot, they had been wandering around the mountains and caves like wild animals, therefore carrying ivy-wreathed wands and beautiful branches, and also fronds of palm, they offered hymns of thanksgiving. Okay, so what this is saying is that the Beit HaMikdash in Tishrei had been defiled, right? It was still dirty, it was still impure. The Hashmonaim only rededicated it in Kislev, right? We're much later in the year. So in the same way, almost like you could say that there's an idea of Pesach Sheni, right? That if you can't give the Pesach off, you can't have Pesach on the right time, in that case, you do it a month later. So what Second Maccabees seems to be saying, at least according to this author, he thinks, he's basically saying that at the time that the Hashmonaim came in and rededicated the temple in Kislev, they said, now finally we can celebrate Sukkot, which we weren't able to do properly back in Tishrei. Let's do that now. Okay, so that's why above it said, we want you to celebrate the festival of Sukkot. You're like, what's that about? Okay, so that's what they're talking about. And the rest, this is just, we won't go through this in detail, but the book of Second Maccabees is full of lots of miracles, tons of miracles. Okay, so actually, you know what? I'm not going to go through it, but it's like there's a lot in Second Maccabees that's super interesting. Again, a lot of miracles, and the message seems to be that Chanukah dates back to something older. It dates back to the times of Nehemiah. Okay, it's a celebration of Sukkot in the same way as Nehemiah celebrated Sukkot. Actually, let's look at that. You know, that'll be helpful. Okay, sorry, I should have done that. So Nehemiah, this is what they're referring to. In the book of Nehemiah, in the 8th chapter, it says that everybody came. This is when, you know, the people returned to Israel. They're given the ability to rebuild the Mizbeach by Cyrus the Great, you know, Cyrus, Persian Empire. And then Ezra takes out, it says Torah Moshe, and he reads it to the people. And then it says on the first day of the 7th month, that's Rosh Hashanah, Ezra the priest brought the teaching, the Torah, before the congregation, men and women, and all who could listen with understanding. So he reads the Torah on Rosh Hashanah of that year. And then it says they found written in the teaching of the Lord, basically in the Torah, that that the Israelites should dwell in booths during the festival of the 7th month, that they should sit in Sukkot, Bechad Chodesh Hashvi'i. And when they read that, then they went out and they did all the stuff. They got the palm and they got the myrtle, they got all these leafy branches, okay? And they go and they celebrate Sukkot. So it's a similar kind of story that when Nehemiah comes back, the people are so excited that now finally they can celebrate Sukkot properly with the new Beit HaMikdash. And they made Sukkot. And okay, and so that, okay, so with that background, that's basically what the book of Second Maccabees is referring to when it says that we also in the times of the Hashmonaim, when they got back to the Beit HaMikdash, they, like Nehemiah before them, were excited to be able to have a proper Sukkot. And then also it adds this other idea of this incredible fire that, you know, that Nehemiah had saved. Okay, that's not something that we, you know, have in our tradition. But let's just take a step back. The theological message that this writer in the land of Israel, in Judea, is sending to his brethren in Egypt, the message is that that Hashem performs miracles for those who return. Okay, that Hanukkah is an important holiday because it actually has kind of yichus that goes all the way back to the times of Nehemiah. It's not something that we just made up recently. It actually goes all the way back to this fire festival of Nehemiah. It's similar in its practice in that it has this Sukkot-like feature, which maybe has something to do with 8 days, and that it's full of miracles. Again, that Hashem performs miracles in our day that are worth celebrating. Okay, I'm going to go through. There's just one more source worth noting, and then we'll get to the what's this all about. Okay, but one more source worth mentioning is Josephus. Okay, Josephus says that now he's writing in the first century, so he's not, he's 150-ish or whatever, 130 roughly years older than the Mishnah, but much far after the Book of Maccabees. He says, now Judah celebrated the festival of the restoration of the sacrifices of the temple for 8 days. Doesn't explain why. The second book of Maccabees had linked it up to 8 days as like Sukkot 8 days. Josephus doesn't explain why. He just says it's an 8-day holiday. Then he says they should keep their festival on account of the restoration of the temple worship for 8 days. And from that time to this, we celebrate this festival and call it lights. He says that there's something about the name of the holiday that we call it like the Festival of Lights. I suppose the reason was, Josephus says, because this liberty beyond our hopes appeared to us, and that hence was the name given to that festival. So what's he saying there? It's interesting. He doesn't mention the miracle of the oil. He doesn't talk about specifically anything having to do with lighting the menorah, but he knows that the holiday has something to do with lights, and he allegorizes that and says, lights must mean, or I suppose the reason for this name is because we were triumphant and found liberty. We found light. And because of that, the Festival of Lights refers not to candles, but to finding light in this time of historical darkness, you could say. Okay. And one more source that I'm not going to go through together, but it's interesting to know that it exists. It's not actually part of our, tradition in the way of the Midrashim and the Mishnah of the Gemara. But it is interesting to know that there is actually something called Megillat Antiochus, and that scroll is much later, it was written much later, but it's written kind of in the style of Megillat Esther. So whereas Megillat Esther starts by Yehi b'mei Achashverosh, okay, Megillat Antiochus starts by Yehi b'mei Antiochus, Melech Yavan, and it goes on and it tells the story of Hanukkah specifically, kind of like trying to create a Megillah that's similar to what Megillat Esther does for Purim. It mentions the miracle of the oil in it. It also focuses a lot on the war. Okay, again, it's not part of our. It's certainly not part of Tanakh. It's not considered authoritative, though it is interesting to note that certain communities took on the custom to read this on Hanukkah. So it actually, in some communities, was treated with kind of like a religious respect. It was actually read on Hanukkah in some communities. Okay, and now here's really the last source. Okay, here's really the last source, and then I promise you we will unpack it. We kind of have to set the whole thing up, but then we'll unpack it. Okay, here's a Gemara in Avodah Zarah. Let's go through it. I'm going to read through it, and then we'll see what it means. So it says, the Mishnah says, "Ve'elu eidehem shel avdei kochavim." These are the festivals of the star worshippers. Basically, that's what we call idolaters. Okay, on this list, it includes Kalenda, Sater Nura. Okay, and we would call these Kalenda. Okay, and Saturnalia. That's a holiday that we actually know about, Saturnalia. The Gemara goes on to say, I'm just going to run through this in English. Kalenda is kept on 8 days following the solstice. Saturnalia on 8 days preceding the solstice. What's the background? The Gemara says, when Adam Harishon saw the day getting gradually shorter, he said, "Oili, woe is to me. Maybe this is happening because I've sinned." Okay, so when basically at the time of year when the days start, as we head into winter and the days get shorter, Adam HaRishon said, wow, this is bad. Every day is darker than the day before. Maybe I should take a lesson from this. Maybe I did something wrong, okay? So he kept an 8-day fast. But as he observed the winter solstice and noted that the day started to get increasingly longer, he said, this is the world's course, okay? So once he got to the darkest days of the year, and now we start to head into spring, and the days start to get longer, then he realized, no, this is just the way of the world. The days get shorter into the winter, and now they're going to start getting longer as we head into spring, and he set forth to keep an 8-day festivity. Okay, that is Saturnalia. Okay, Saturnalia was a pagan festival that happened at the time of the winter solstice, at the time of the darkest days of the year, when the days stopped getting dark and started getting lighter. Okay, so this is very interesting. And so in the following year, he appointed both as festivals, both the kind of the first thing that he had fasted originally, but he turned that into a holiday of when the days start to get shorter, and then he made it a holiday when the days start to get longer. That is what Kalenda and Saturnalia. Okay, so now he fixed them for the sake of heaven. He did this with kind of pure intention, but the unenlightened appointed them for the sake of star worship, or vehem kav'um l'shem avodat kochavim. People came later and messed it up. Adam HaRishon had done this with pure intention. When nature was starting to get darker, when the day started to get darker, he said, oh, I should look into myself. Have I done something wrong? When he realized that it actually wasn't the case, he celebrated it. He celebrated the amazing world that Hashem gave him. All of that was with pure intention. Later, people came along and messed it up and turned it into a pagan holiday. So says the Gemara. Okay. So now, that's very, very interesting. So, let's try to connect that, because that's actually this last piece about Saturnalia, I think, is just super interesting. So what we remember that when it was talking about the ways that the pagans forced their practices on the Jews, or I should say, I don't know that I read this line, but there's an interesting line where it says in the book of Second Maccabees, actually I didn't read this line, Second Maccabees mentions that the Jews were forced to walk in a procession on the Feast of Bacchus. Okay, the Feast of Bacchus is a winter solstice festival, which is called Brumalia, apparently. I'm not going to claim to be any big expert in pagan holidays, but apparently this Feast of Bacchus is called Brumalia, and this actually is a holiday that concluded every year on the 24th of December. And recall that both books of Maccabees had pointed out the pagan defilement of the Beit HaMikdash happened in late Kislev, which is right around the times of this solstice festival. It's just to point out that both book of Maccabees explain that the date of the rededication of the temple, the date of Hanukkah, is some kind of counterpoint to the pagan festival, to the date on which the pagans decided to defile the temple. And that date on which the pagans decided to defile the temple seems to be right around this holiday of, Brumalia and Saturnalia, these kind of darkest day of the year pagan festivals. Okay, so with all of that as background, there's a super interesting theory that was put forward by Rabbi Yoel Ben Nun of Yeshivat Har Etzion, right, Gush, and he suggests, his reading of putting all this together, is he says that there's something called the Festival of Lights that's very old. You could say as old as Adam HaRishon. Okay, thinking of that Gemara that we just read in Avodah Zarah, and he points out also that there's a Mishnah in Bikurim that seems to treat Hanukkah. This is one of the other, of the 7 mentions in the Mishnah of Hanukkah. That Mishnah in Bikurim seems to discuss Hanukkah as part of the agricultural cycle. So there, the Mishnah is talking about different times of year when people can bring Bikurim, and in some cases, depending on when you bring it, you do different things with it. Okay, but it says from Shavuot until Sukkot, you bring the Bikurim and you do the recitation of the lines that go along with it, okay? The Mikra of Bikurim, okay? But then it says, this is the surprising line, it says, from Sukkot until Chanukah, you bring it, but you don't recite. So what Rav Ben Nun is pointing out is it's very unusual. What does Chanukah have to do with Bikurim? Bikurim is something that's deoraita. It goes all the way back to the Torah. Chanukah is something that comes much later. How can the date of Chanukah have anything to do with the way that you bring your Bikurim? He hypothesizes that maybe, again, Chanukah, the date of Chanukah, and perhaps the festival of lights that's associated with that date is older than Chanukah, okay? Is older than Chanukah, meaning that perhaps, and again, this is his conjecture, but this is the way he pieces it together, perhaps there was a pre-existing agricultural celebration, the kind of celebration of that time of year that was of pure intention, like the way that the Gemara describes Adam Harishon, celebrating nature in its proper way, in its kind of God-fearing way, okay? And that's and that predates the story of Hanukkah, and it predates when the rabbis sanctioned Hanukkah itself as a religious holiday, not just as an agricultural celebration. And clearly what he has in mind is he's making a connection to the way the Shalosh Regalim have two sides, right? On the one hand, they have an agricultural aspect, and on the other hand, they have a historical aspect, right? So he's making that same kind of connection with respect to Hanukkah, that maybe there was once an agricultural connection, and then it got kind of a historical overlay based on the Hanukkah story as it happened. Okay, hopefully that's clear. And that's why Rabbi Nun says even further that maybe that helps explain why even after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, still the holiday of Hanukkah continued to have resonance and continued to be celebrated in the way that a lot of those holidays of the Second Temple period are no longer celebrated, because there was already a festival of lights, there was already a holiday of this time of year that predated the dedication of the Beit HaMikdash aspect. So even when the Beit HaMikdash aspect disappeared in this theory, there was still a reason to continue celebrating the holiday. Okay, this is very, very kind of innovative, interesting theory. I'm sure I'm not giving it its full justice, but I think that's it's just very, a very, very interesting way to approach how to put together all of these sources and take away some additional layer of meaning to the holiday. Okay, so let's kind of recap a little bit. The Gemara and Shabbat. So we're going to stop with the sources and we're going to think it through. The Gemara and Shabbat, as we saw, asked the question, Mai Chanukah, what's Hanukkah? But as we've seen, that question has a bunch of different layers. So that could include questions like, what does the holiday of Hanukkah commemorate? What's its origins? It could also be, why do we light why do we light candles on Hanukkah? Which is a slightly different question, but it fits into what the Gemara is talking about there. Remember, the Gemara was talking about lighting Shabbos candles, then it got into the business of talking about Hanukkah candles. So maybe that's what the Mai Chanukah question is really about, not just like, what is Hanukkah? What does it commemorate? But specifically with respect to why do we light candles? And that's why it focuses on the Pach HaShemen in particular. Similarly, another question that is, why is Hanukkah 8 days long? Okay, another question, why do we still celebrate Hanukkah, unlike all those other holidays from the second Beit HaMikdash? And so what I tried to do was at least give us all of the textual background to attack each of these questions separately. So let's go through, as a recap, what we saw from each of the sources. So question one, what does the holiday of Hanukkah commemorate? So in the simplest sense, the holiday commemorates the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash after it had been defiled by the pagans, by the Greeks. And after all, the holiday's name, Hanukkah, means inauguration. So that's a pretty good clue. Hanukkah is about the re-inauguration of the Beit HaMikdash. Okay. Now, second, this rededication, this Chanukah Tamizbeach, couldn't have happened without the improbable and miraculous triumph of the Maccabees in their war against a much stronger power. So the holiday also commemorates that victory, as we saw in Al-Hanisim. It also celebrates the miraculous story of the oil, the Pach HaShemen, which we saw highlighted in the Gemara and Shabbat. It also is the festival of lights, which perhaps is an older nature-based holiday that takes place at the darkest time in the year, as kind of alluded to in the Gemara and Avodah Zarah. And maybe the focus on lighting a candle amid the darkness can be allegorized the way Josephus did, about bringing light into the darkest times of Jewish history, how we survived in the darkest times, okay? When the flame of Torah was almost put out, okay? So those are all ways of explaining what is Hanukkah about. It's about all those things, okay? Now, why do we light candles on Hanukkah? So a bunch of answers. Well, every kid knows we light candles on Hanukkah because of the Pach HaShemen, the miracle of the one jug that lit for 8 days. And that shows up, as we saw, in the Gemara and Shabbat and Megillat Ta'anit. But we also saw, even in traditional sources, another idea, that we light candles to remember the lighting of a menorah made of spears, that we turned a military victory into a religious triumph. And that was noted also in Megillat Ta'anit and also in the Midrash, in Psikta Rabati. Okay? Perhaps also we light candles as part of a festival of lights, as discussed. And we also saw an idea in 2 Maccabees, this idea of the festival of fire. That's not part of our, that's a kind of a different thing. But anyways, it is mentioned that, there is this kind of fire aspect. Okay, that doesn't show up in our sources. Okay. Next question. Why is Hanukkah 8 days long? Again, there are a number of different answers that come out of the sources we went through. Maybe it's because the candles miraculously lasted for 8 days. Or maybe, right, that's what it said in Masechet Ta'anit, or at least it talks about the 8 days, and as quoted in the Gemara. But also, perhaps it took 8 days to clean up and prep the Beit HaMikdash. That's the explanation that Megillat Ta'anit actually gave when it asked why 8 days. Or maybe it's 8 days because it's like a Sukkot Sheni, when they rededicated the Beit HaMikdash, mirroring the Sukkot of Nehemiah. Okay, possibly. And there are many more reasons in the Rishonim and Achronim for this question of why 8 days. This is a much asked and much answered question. Now, at this point, you might say, why are you making all of this so complicated? I know what we're celebrating on Hanukkah, right? As the old joke says, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. Okay, that for a lot of people is Hanukkah. But I actually think, and hopefully this will resonate, with everyone else on, that recognizing the fact that the holiday has multiple layers, that it's not just one simple thing, actually helps us experience the holiday in a deeper way. And so this is going to be, I'm sorry we're running a little long, but this is the last section of the shiur, which is to think a little bit about what does it mean for Hanukkah to be a holiday that has different layers of meaning? Because when we're kids, Hanukkah is probably about the presents. As we get older, we start to learn a little bit more about it. But at least my takeaway is there's an even deeper sense in which we can take away from the holiday having multiple layers of meaning. And I should point out that the fact that Hanukkah has multiple layers of meaning really isn't all that different than our other holidays. So if you think about it, the whole expectation that there should be one clear answer, what is the real reason for the holiday, is a bit odd. It's not like our other holidays. So think about the Shalosh Regalim, which embody a whole bunch of different themes. So for example, you would never ask when your kid comes home from school, you would never say, wait a second, is Pesach really Chag HaAviv? Or is it really Zman Cherutenu? Or is it really Chag HaMatzot? Or is it really Chag HaPesach? That question makes no sense. We don't think which of these is it really. We know that Pesach is all of those things, right? It's just a holiday that has a bunch of different themes. And similarly, and we saw, if you remember, for those who were on the Tishrei shiur, in the Tishrei installment of this series of shiurim, we discussed that there is a debate in the Gemara about whether the Sukkot that we sit in on Sukkot really represent the clouds of glory, or whether they really represent literal Sukkot. Okay, we went through that. And I think the takeaway of that shiur was that there isn't one right answer. It's really both. Anyways, I'll refer you to that for a lot more detail. But the question of which is it really kind of overstates, or, maybe doesn't quite get at it. It's really both. And it's not just that the multiple meanings can be intertwined. So, for example, Pesach, Chag HaAviv, is the spring, the holiday of the spring. That is the time of nature's rebirth. It's also the time, historically, of our people's rebirth after Yetziat Mitzrayim, at Yetziat Mitzrayim. Similarly, the Shavuot, Hag HaKatzir, is the harvest, when we receive the gifts that Hashem gives us from the field. So too, Shavuot is the holiday on which we receive God's gifts of the Torah. So these are different themes, but there's themes that have kind of an internal, link and logic to them. Okay, so once you start to notice that all of our holidays have multiple layers of meaning, right? I mean, it's never ending. Rosh Hashanah, what is it? It's like it's the beginning of the year. It's when we inaugurate Hashem. It's when we have a certain din. So all of our holidays have multiple layers of meaning, okay? And basically, all of these different themes function like different ingredients in a recipe, okay? All of our holidays are complex, they're multifaceted, and of course, we can pick out individual elements and focus on each on its own, but it's really the combination of all that good stuff in one big recipe that gives our tradition its richness. And one benefit of having multiple facets to a holiday, which is interesting, is that as circumstances change in different times, some of the meanings may resonate more with us and some less. And in other times, the opposite. So for example, I always like to think about how would it have felt to celebrate this holiday at a different time? Imagine celebrating Hanukkah in the times of the Mishnah, right? Imagine celebrating a holiday that recalls the rededication of the temple when you're living at a time when the Beit HaMikdash had just been destroyed like 130 years ago. It would have felt different than it feels for us. Or similarly, imagine celebrating a holiday that focuses on a military victory over the Greeks when you're living like 65 years after Bar Kokhba, and that military uprising is completely destroyed by the Romans. It just has a different feel. You can imagine in around the year 200, around the time of the Mishnah, celebrating Hanukkah just had to feel different to the extent that you focused on the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash or the military victory. But on the other hand, you have other layers of meaning. You have this festival of lights kind of theme of the darkest time of the year. The darkest times of Jewish history are exactly when we light the candles and we bring light into the world. And wouldn't that have been kind of particularly meaningful at that time? Actually, in our days, we can relate a little more to what it means to be a modern day Maccabee, because as I've discussed before, like the Sahal as the modern day Maccabee kind of has more resonance today. We understand that a little bit better. Anyways, multiple themes, all of them relevant at all times, and maybe some particularly resonant and relevant in certain times. So, okay, Hanukkah made the cut. It made the cut as a holiday that was able to stay meaningful for generations and continue to be part of our practice and part of the normative halacha, even after the Maccabees were gone, even after all those other holidays from Megillat Ta'anit went away. At least a lot of them did, okay? Hanukkah persists, okay? And I think, again, part of it is that the holiday had multiple layers of meaning that made it more flexible and more meaningful than, for example, Har Gerizim Day. Mount Gerizim Day is the one that celebrated the failure of the Samaritans to turn the Greeks against the Jews. Okay, that was a great thing that happened in history, but it didn't continue to be meaningful. It didn't continue to be part of what the rabbis thought was important enough for us to continue practicing forever. Hanukkah is a holiday, maybe you can add, that celebrates not only events of the past, but also gives us hope for the future. If the holiday was just about the past, then maybe it would not have continued on. But Hanukkah has this aspect where we think that as the Maccabees were victorious, so too we will be victorious again. As the Beit HaMikdash was once cleansed and rededicated, it will be cleansed and rededicated again. And we light the candles to light up, again, the darkest time of the year, just as we keep faith in the most difficult times of Jewish history, okay? And so another way of saying that is that Hanukkah, I would suggest, persists because it's a please wrapped up in a thank you, okay? A please wrapped up in a thank you. And the best model for that is Pesach, okay? Think about on Pesach. We start the Haggadah by saying, Hashata Hacha, right? L'shana haba b'arad Yisrael. We're now here. Next year we'll be in Israel. We're now slaves. Next year, we will be free people. It's possible that we're just role playing, right? Acting as if we are in Egypt. But maybe we are here. We're saying we are here today now as slaves and in exile. Next year, we will be in Israel, or perhaps multiple meanings. But there are other clues that are even stronger. So for example, when we go through the 10 plagues, suddenly out of nowhere, we quote this line out of Yoel, the book of Yoel, Dam va'esh v'timrot ashan. What's that? Have you ever wondered? So that actually is from the book of Yoel, talking about a vision of the future judgment day. And so by quoting that, what we're saying is that not only were the Egyptians of old punished with plagues, but so too, future tyrants will also be punished when the great judgment day comes. We have the cup of Eliyahu. We say Lashana Haba B'Yerushalayim. So Pesach, it's pretty clear, is about saying thank you for the past, but again, it's a please wrapped up in a thank you. It's a please for the future wrapped up in a thank you for the past. So too with Hanukkah. For generations, Jews celebrated the rededication of the Beit HaMikdash that was destroyed because they looked forward to a future Chanukah HaMizbeach. And for generations, Jews celebrated Maccabean victories because they hoped for triumphs over modern day tyrants as well. They lit Hanukkah candles at the darkest time of the year to give hope that they also would see brighter days. Again, I keep saying it's a please wrapped up in a thank you. Maybe that's what we mean in part when we say Bayamim Hahem Bazman Hazeh, in those days, in our times. So we started the night by looking at the traditional sources and also some other ancient Jewish sources about Hanukkah. And we noted that there's a lot more going on with this holiday than simply, they tried to kill us, we won, let's eat. It's a much deeper kind of holiday. We noted that Hanukkah has multiple themes, just like all of our holidays have multiple themes. And we noted that the fact that the holiday has these multiple layers allows Hanukkah to stay fresh for us in different times and circumstances. Right? It allows an ancient holiday to stay current for us today, because ultimately our holidays are about saying please in the context of a thank you. So we celebrate our past as a way of looking forward to a greater future ahead of us. I'll leave off with that thought. Thanks, everyone. Chodesh Tov.